When the fake HOA cop pulled his SUV behind me with flashing lights, I almost laughed. But when he drew his weapon and ordered me out of my truck, I knew this wasn't just another HOA power trip. This was something far more dangerous. The blue and red lights flashed in my rearview mirror on Oak Ridge Drive, just 2 miles from my home. My first thought was that I must have been speeding, though I was positive I'd been doing exactly 25 in this residential zone. Old habits from my Army days die hard. Situational awareness had been drilled into me for 25 years. I pulled over, watching as a black Ford Explorer with tinted windows stopped behind me. Something felt off immediately. The lights weren't mounted on the roof but appeared to be temporary, stuck to the dashboard. In my side mirror, I could see a man emerging from the vehicle, dressed in what looked like tactical gear with bright yellow lettering across the chest. HOA enforcement. You've got to be kidding me. I'd moved to Oak Ridge Estates 3 months ago after retiring from the Army. After a quarter-century of military service, including 4 tours overseas, I thought I'd finally found peace in this quiet suburban neighborhood outside of Columbus. The house was perfect. Good bones, as they say, with a yard big enough for my German Shepherd, Rex, and a garage spacious enough for my woodworking projects. What the realtor had conveniently glossed over was the Homeowners Association from hell, run by Karen Winters, a 60-something woman with a blonde bob that never moved and a personality as rigid as her hairspray. The man approaching my truck wore a tactical vest over a polo shirt, khaki pants, and had a holstered object on his hip. He walked with the exaggerated swagger of someone who'd watched too many cop shows but had never actually served a day in uniform. "License and registration," he barked, standing awkwardly at my window, hand hovering near his hip like he was in some kind of standoff. I recognized him immediately, Dave Peterson, Karen's right-hand man on the HOA board. The same guy who'd left a citation on my door last week because my trash can had remained at the curb for approximately 3.5 hours beyond the acceptable window for waste receptacle visibility. "Dave, what the hell are you doing?" I asked, not making any move to comply. "You're not a cop." His face reddened. "That's Officer Peterson to you, Miller. The board has authorized enhanced enforcement protocols for repeat violators." I couldn't help but laugh. "Enhanced enforcement? You can't pull people over, Dave. That's impersonating a law enforcement officer. It's a felony." His hand moved closer to what I now realized was a holster. The HOA bylaws, Section 47B, Paragraph 3, clearly state that the board may employ necessary measures to ensure community compliance. What would you do if someone impersonating law enforcement pulled you over? Would you comply or challenge them? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. As a veteran, I've been trained to assess threats, but most civilians haven't had that experience. It's a scary situation that's happening more often than you might think. I kept my hands visible on the steering wheel, my military training kicking in as I assessed the situation. Dave was agitated, power-drunk, and possibly armed. Behind him, I could see Karen's white Mercedes pulling up. Great, the cavalry had arrived. "Step out of the vehicle, Miller," Dave demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "You violated HOA codes 17 times in 3 months. The board has voted to impound your vehicle until fines are paid in full." "That's not how any of this works, Dave," I said calmly, though my heart was beginning to race. "You can't impound my truck. You're not law enforcement." Karen approached, her face set in that pinched expression I'd come to know well. "Mr. Miller, your continued defiance of community standards leaves us no choice but to escalate enforcement." Dave's hand moved to his holster and he unsnapped it, pulling out what looked like a weapon. My combat instincts flared to life. "Final warning," he said, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was an intimidating growl. "Exit the vehicle now or I will be forced to extract you." The absurdity of the situation might have been comical if not for the very real object in Dave's hand. Was that a taser or something worse? In that moment, I realized this wasn't just another ridiculous HOA power trip. These people had crossed a dangerous line, and I was now facing a genuine threat on a public road, less than 2 miles from the home I'd bought to enjoy my retirement. I slowly reached for the door handle, my mind racing through possible scenarios, when I noticed something in my rearview mirror that made me freeze. A line of olive-drab vehicles had appeared on the road behind us, and they were slowing down. Dave noticed my gaze shift and turned his head slightly. "Don't try to distract me, Miller. Out of the truck. Now." But I wasn't trying to distract him. I was watching as the first vehicle in what was clearly a military convoy pulled to a stop behind Karen's Mercedes. And I couldn't help the slow smile that spread across my face. 3 months earlier, I'd never even heard of a compliance citation or aesthetic violation. Now I was staring down the barrel of what I hoped was just a taser, all because I refused to paint my mailbox the approved shade of autumn whisper. My journey into HOA hell began on a perfect spring morning. After 25 years of moving from base to base, living in military housing where beige was the only approved color and personality was measured in how well you could hide it, I was finally planting roots. Oak Ridge Estates seemed ideal. Mature trees, quarter-acre lots, and neighbors who waved as I pulled up in the moving truck. The first week was bliss. I unpacked at my own pace, arranged my furniture how I wanted it, and even hung my Army memorabilia on the walls without asking anyone's permission. Freedom tasted sweet. Then came the knock on my door. "Good morning. I'm Karen Winters, president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association." She stood on my porch with a gift basket that looked professionally wrapped, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "We're so delighted to have a veteran in our community." I invited her in like an idiot. That was my first mistake. While I made coffee, Karen conducted what I later realized was an inspection. She handed me a 3-ring binder that weighed as much as my old field manual. "Our community guidelines," she explained, patting the monstrous document. "Everything you need to know to be a compliant member of our little paradise." I thanked her, set the binder aside, and thought that was that. The next morning, I found my first citation taped to my door. Unapproved display of flag, Section 12.3. American flags may only be displayed on approved holidays and must not exceed 3 feet by 5 feet. I'd hung my flag the day I moved in, the same flag that had been folded and presented to me at my retirement ceremony. I read the citation twice, convinced it was a joke. It wasn't. I called the number listed and got Karen herself. "The guidelines clearly state that flag displays must be approved by the Aesthetics Committee," she explained, as if talking to a child. "We meet on the first Tuesday of each month. You can submit your request then." "It's an American flag," I said, "and I'm pretty sure there are federal laws protecting my right to display it." "Well," she replied, her voice cooling several degrees, "we'll just have to see about that, won't we?" I hung up and immediately looked up the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act of 2005. Sure enough, it prohibited HOAs from restricting homeowners from displaying the U.S. flag. I printed it out and taped it to my door, right next to my flag. The next day, I received 2 more citations. Unauthorized posting of documents on exterior surfaces, Section 8.7. Failure to submit landscaping plan, Section 15.2. I hadn't even touched my lawn yet. Over the next few weeks, the citations multiplied like rabbits. My mailbox was the wrong shade of black, apparently. There are 50 shades of black approved by the HOA, and mine wasn't one of them. The wreath on my door contained non-indigenous flora. My garden hose was visible from the street, a violation of Section 17.9, exterior maintenance equipment storage. I tried reasoning with them. I tried ignoring them. I even tried attending an HOA meeting, which was held in Karen's living room and felt more like a court-martial than a neighborhood discussion. That's where I met the rest of Karen's enforcement team. Dave Peterson, a retired insurance adjuster who'd found his true calling in measuring grass height with a ruler. Marge Whitfield, who photographed violations from her golf cart as she patrolled the neighborhood. And Tom Gaines, who kept the HOA books and spoke in terms of property value impact assessments. They sat in matching chairs while the rest of us, the regular homeowners, perched on folding seats like supplicants before royalty. When I raised my hand to discuss the flag issue, Karen smiled thinly. "We have a full agenda tonight, Mr. Miller. Please submit your concern in writing for next month's meeting." After the meeting, A couple approached me in the driveway, Bill and Sarah Johnson, who lived 2 doors down. "Don't take it personally," Bill said, glancing over his shoulder. "They target all the newcomers, especially if you stand out." "Stand out?" I asked. Sarah lowered her voice. "Veterans, first responders, anyone who might question authority. They've been running this neighborhood like their personal fiefdom for years." Bill nodded. "They forced the Ramirez family out last year. Jose was a firefighter. They cited him for having his work boots on the porch. Said it was occupational equipment storage in a residential zone." I learned that Karen's husband was a mid-level manager in the county clerk's office, which explained how they'd gotten away with their reign of terror for so long. Any complaints mysteriously disappeared from the county records. The final straw came when I installed a small fountain in my backyard. Not visible from the street, mind you, as a meditation spot. I'd picked up the habit of mindfulness to help with my PTSD, and the sound of running water was soothing. The next day, Dave Peterson was peering over my fence with a camera. "Water features require prior approval," he called out, snapping photos. "Section 22.1. You're trespassing," I informed him. "HOA bylaws permit inspection from adjacent properties," he replied smugly. That night, I installed security cameras covering every inch of my property. If they wanted to play games, I'd make sure I had evidence. The day I installed security cameras was the day Karen declared war. "Recording board members is a violation of HOA privacy statutes," she screamed through my doorbell speaker. I didn't have the heart to tell her there was no such thing. I was having too much fun watching her face turn the exact shade of red they'd rejected for my front door. I started documenting everything. Every citation, every encounter, every ridiculous rule they invented on the spot. I called my old Army buddy Mike, now a lawyer specializing in property law. "They can't do half the things they're claiming," he told me after reviewing their bylaws. "Their covenant expired 5 years ago and was never properly renewed. They're operating on intimidation and bluffs." Armed with this knowledge, I began my counteroffensive. I filed formal requests for financial records. I asked for minutes of all meetings for the past 5 years. I demanded to see the official renewal of the covenant. Karen's team responded by escalating their harassment. Daily drive-bys, photographs of my house from every angle. Citations slipped under my door at midnight. Then they targeted my American flag again, this time claiming it was mounted incorrectly. That's when I learned they'd been harassing other veterans in the neighborhood too. Bill introduced me to Frank, a Vietnam vet who'd been fined for having a Marine Corps sticker on his car window, and Rachel, who served in Desert Storm, had been cited for planting a victory garden with vegetables instead of approved ornamental plants. We started meeting regularly, comparing notes and building a case. I discovered the HOA had been issuing fake fines and threatening legal action without actual authority for years. They'd even placed liens on homes without legal standing to do so. One evening, as I was reviewing their so-called financial statements, I noticed something odd. The HOA fees, $350 per month from each of the 120 homes in the neighborhood, didn't match the expenditures. Not even close. Where was the money going? The next morning, I found an official-looking document taped to my door. Final notice of property seizure for non-compliance. I read it twice, my blood pressure rising with each word. According to this notice, the HOA was planning to place a lien on my home for unpaid fines totaling $17,450 and would begin foreclosure proceedings in 30 days. It was printed on what looked like legal letterhead, with a county seal that was slightly blurry, as if it had been copied from somewhere else. The signature at the bottom wasn't from Karen or Dave, but from someone claiming to be a county enforcement officer. I knew then that they'd crossed the line from harassment into fraud. This wasn't just an HOA drunk on power, this was criminal activity. I called Mike again. "How fast can you get here?" I asked. "I think I've got them." The day I installed security cameras was the day Karen declared war. "Recording board members is a violation of HOA privacy statutes," she screamed. I didn't have the heart to tell her there was no such thing. I was having too much fun watching her face turn the exact shade of red they'd rejected for my front door. I'd set up a state-of-the-art security system, with cameras covering every angle of my property. It wasn't cheap, but after 25 years in the Army, I knew the value of good intelligence. The system sent alerts to my phone whenever it detected movement, and I could live stream the footage from anywhere. The morning after the installation, my phone buzzed at 6:15 a.m. I opened the app to see Dave Peterson, decked out in his ridiculous HOA enforcement vest, measuring my grass with a ruler. I watched, amused, as he meticulously documented each blade that dared to exceed the mandated 2.5-inch height. When he approached my front door to leave yet another citation, I used the speaker function on my doorbell camera. "Good morning, Dave. Lovely day for some lawn care, isn't it?" He jumped like he'd been shocked, looking around wildly for the source of my voice. When he spotted the camera, his face contorted into a scowl. "This is a violation of HOA guidelines, Miller. Section 31.4 clearly states that all exterior modifications must be approved by the board." "I know," I interrupted. "Funny thing, though, I checked with the county, and there's no permit requirement for installing home security systems. So unless you'd like to explain to the police why you're trespassing on my property, I suggest you step off my porch." Dave's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He dropped the citation and scurried away, but not before I captured a beautiful high-definition video of his retreat. Within an hour, Karen was at my door, flanked by Marge and Tom. I didn't bother answering, instead watching their performance on my tablet. "Mr. Miller, this is your final warning." Karen's voice was shrill enough to make dogs howl 3 blocks away. "Remove these cameras immediately or face severe consequences." I pressed the intercom button. "Good morning, Karen. I'm afraid I can't do that. You see, I have a right to secure my property, especially given the recent uptick in trespassing and harassment." "Harassment?" Tom sputtered. "We are merely enforcing community standards. Is that what you call forging official documents and issuing fraudulent fines?" I asked calmly, because I'm pretty sure the county prosecutor would have a different term for it. The color drained from their faces. Marge tugged on Karen's sleeve, whispering something I couldn't quite catch. They huddled for a moment before Karen turned back to the camera, her plastic smile firmly in place. "Now, Mr. Miller, I'm sure this is all a misunderstanding. Why don't you come to our next board meeting? We can discuss your concerns in a civilized manner." I almost laughed. "I'll consider it, Karen. In the meantime, I'll be keeping these cameras right where they are. Have a nice day." As they walked away, I could hear Karen hissing at the others. "Find out everything you can about him. I want to know every skeleton in his closet." Little did she know, my closet was pretty bare. 25 years of military service had taught me to live a clean, disciplined life. But 2 could play at this game. I spent the next week digging into the backgrounds of our esteemed HOA board members. It wasn't hard. Most of them overshared on social media like teenagers. Dave, it turned out, had been fired from his insurance job for creative accounting. Marge had a suspended driver's license but was still tooling around the neighborhood in her golf cart. And Tom? Well, Tom had a little online gambling problem that I was sure his wife didn't know about. But Karen was the real prize. Her Facebook page was a goldmine of hypocrisy. Photos of her prize-winning roses, which I knew for a fact weren't on the HOA's approved plant list. A new pergola in her backyard that had mysteriously appeared without going through the approval process she so rigorously enforced on others. And the coup de grace. A photo of her poodle, Mitzi, prancing around her unfenced front yard, despite the HOA's strict leash laws. Armed with this information, I decided to attend the next HOA meeting. As I walked into Karen's immaculate living room, the conversation stopped abruptly. Every head turned to stare at me. "Mr. Miller," Karen said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "How unexpected. We're so glad you could join us." I took a seat in the back, next to Bill and Sarah. "Wouldn't miss it for the world," I replied with a smile. The meeting proceeded with mind-numbing discussions about the appropriate shade of beige for exterior paint and whether wind chimes constituted noise pollution. I waited patiently for the open forum section. When Karen finally, reluctantly, called on me, I stood up. "I have some concerns about the way this HOA is being run," I began. "Mr. Miller, we've been over this," Karen interrupted. "If you have complaints, you need to submit them in writing." "I'm not finished," I said firmly. "I've done some research and I've found some irregularities in the HOA's operations." The room went silent. I could feel the tension crackling in the air. "For starters, your covenant expired 5 years ago and was never properly renewed. That means most of the rules you've been enforcing aren't legally binding." Dave jumped to his feet. "That's ridiculous. We renewed the covenant in 2018. "Really?" I asked, pulling out a stack of papers. "Because I have here the county records, which show no such renewal. In fact, they show no communication from this HOA since 2015. Karen's face had gone from red to white. "Those records are incomplete," she stammered. "Tom, show him the renewal documents." Tom shuffled through his briefcase, looking increasingly panicked. I must have left them at home," he muttered. I pressed on. "I also have concerns about the HOA's financial management. The monthly fees collected from 120 homes should amount to over $500,000 annually. Yet the expenditures reported in your meetings account for less than a quarter of that. Where's the rest of the money going?" The room erupted into chaos. Homeowners who had been silent for years suddenly found their voices, shouting questions and demands. Karen tried to restore order, but her authority was crumbling before her eyes. In the midst of the uproar, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned to see Frank, the Vietnam vet, grinning at me. "Damn, son," he said. "I haven't seen a firefight like this since Kisan." As the meeting devolved into a shouting match, I slipped out the front door. My work here was done. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the HOA's house of cards came tumbling down. The next morning, I woke to find my front yard covered in toilet paper. Rolls of it hung from my trees, draped over my shrubs, and festooned my mailbox. It was almost artistic in its pettiness. I sighed, poured myself a cup of coffee, and settled in to watch the security footage from the night before. Sure enough, there was Dave, sneaking around in the dark like a cut-rate ninja, unrolling toilet paper with the grim determination of a man on a mission. I was tempted to file a police report for vandalism, but I had a better idea. I called Bill and Sarah, Frank, Rachel, and a few other neighbors who'd been victims of the HOA's tyranny. Within an hour, my yard was full of people, laughing and chatting as they cleaned up the mess. We made a game of it with prizes for the most creative use of recovered toilet paper. By noon, my yard was spotless, and the neighborhood had never felt more like a community. As we shared beers and burgers on my newly toilet paper-free lawn, I couldn't help but feel a sense of victory. Karen and her cronies had tried to divide us, but they'd only succeeded in bringing us together. That afternoon, as I was going through my mail, I found an official-looking envelope. Inside was a final notice of property seizure for noncompliance. According to this document, the HOA was planning to place a lien on my home for unpaid fines totaling $17,450 and would begin foreclosure proceedings in 30 days. I stared at the paper, feeling a mixture of anger and disbelief. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was fraud, pure and simple. They were using fake legal documents to try and steal my home. I picked up my phone and dialed Mike's number. My old army buddy turned lawyer answered on the second ring. "Mike," I said, my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. "Remember when I said I might need your help? Well, the time has come. How fast can you get here?" As I hung up, I looked out my window at the peaceful street, now clear of toilet paper and filled with the sounds of neighbors chatting and kids playing. Karen and her lackeys had no idea what was coming. They thought they were dealing with a stubborn old soldier who would eventually fall in line. They were about to learn that they'd picked a fight with the wrong veteran. I've planned missions in active war zones that were less detailed than my strategy to expose the HOA's illegal operation. The difference? In war, you at least know who the enemy is. In suburbia, It's the smiling neighbor borrowing your hedge trimmer while reporting your grass length. Mike arrived 2 days after my call, his SUV packed with legal reference books and a laptop that probably cost more than my first car. He'd put on weight since our army days, but his mind was as sharp as ever. "Jack," he said, giving me a bear hug on my front porch. "You always did know how to find trouble." "Not trouble," I corrected him. "Justice." We spread the documents across my dining room table. Every citation, every threatening letter, every fraudulent legal notice. Mike whistled as he examined the fake foreclosure document. "This is serious, Jack. They're impersonating county officials, forging government seals. That's multiple felonies right there." "So we go to the police?" I asked. Mike shook his head. "Not yet. Local cops might be friends with Karen's husband. We need to build an airtight case first, then take it straight to the state attorney general's office." I nodded. In the military, we called this gathering intelligence before the strike. "First things first," Mike said, pulling out his laptop. "Let's see what we're really dealing with." He spent the next few hours digging through property records, state business filings, and tax documents. What he found confirmed my suspicions and then some. "The Oak Ridge Estates HOA isn't even a legally registered entity," Mike explained, turning his screen toward me. "They filed initial paperwork in 1995, but never completed the process. They've been operating as a phantom organization for decades." "How is that possible?" I asked. "Small town, cozy relationships with local officials, and homeowners too intimidated to question authority," Mike replied. "Classic power abuse scenario." The next revelation was even more damning. The HOA had been collecting dues, over $500,000 annually, but the money wasn't going into community improvements. Instead, it was being funneled through a web of shell companies, all leading back to a property management firm owned by none other than Karen's husband, Robert Winters. "They've been stealing from their neighbors for years," I said, disgusted, "and using intimidation to keep anyone from asking questions," Mike added. "Classic racketeering." We spent the next day drafting a battle plan. First, we needed more evidence, bank records, meeting minutes, proof of the board's knowledge of their illegal activities. Second, we needed allies, not just disgruntled homeowners, but people with authority who could help bring the hammer down. "I know some guys," I said, thinking of my old unit. Many of them had gone into law enforcement after leaving the service. "Good," Mike nodded. "We'll need all the help we can get. These people won't go down without a fight." That evening, I called a meeting at my house. Bill and Sarah came, along with Frank, Rachel, and a dozen other homeowners who'd been victimized by Karen's regime. I laid out what we discovered, watching their expressions shift from shock to anger to determination. "They've been stealing our money," Bill said, his face flushed with anger. "All those years of dues, and look at our neighborhood. Cracked sidewalks, dying trees, and they had the nerve to fine me for my unsightly mailbox." "It's not just the money," Sarah added. "It's the stress, the constant fear of stepping out of line. I've been taking anxiety medication because of these people." One by one, they shared their stories. Frank had been threatened with eviction for displaying his Purple Heart in his front window. Rachel had been fined for parking her car in her own driveway because it was a commercial vehicle. She was a nurse, and her scrubs were visible through the window. An elderly couple had been reduced to tears when the HOA demanded they remove the ramp they'd installed for their disabled son. "Here's what we're going to do," I said, once everyone had spoken. "We need documentation, every interaction, every threat, every penny you've paid them. We need dates, times, witnesses. We're building a case that will stand up in court." The group nodded, energized by the prospect of finally fighting back. "But we need to be smart about this," Mike cautioned. "If they realize we're organizing, they'll destroy evidence. We need to operate covertly until we're ready to strike." I assigned tasks based on people's skills and positions. Bill, who worked at the local bank, would discreetly look into the HOA's accounts. Sarah, a paralegal, would help organize the documentation. Frank, with his connections at the VFW, would reach out to other veterans who might have experienced similar issues in different neighborhoods. "What about me?" Rachel asked. "I want to help, but I'm just a nurse." "Just a nurse?" I smiled. "Rachel, you have access to the hospital where Karen's husband is on the board. You can find out when he's in meetings," giving us a window to observe Karen without him around. As the meeting wrapped up, there was a new energy in the room. These weren't just angry homeowners anymore. They were a team with a mission. The next day, I called my old commanding officer, Colonel James Thompson, now working with the state police. I explained the situation, and he listened without interrupting. "Sounds like you've got yourself a regular little dictatorship there, Jack," he said when I finished. "What do you need from me?" "Intelligence and backup," I replied. "We're gathering evidence for a case, but we need to know who in local law enforcement might be compromised." "I'll make some calls," he promised. "And Jack, be careful. People like that, small-time tyrants with something to lose, they can be dangerous when cornered." I spent the next week coordinating our intelligence-gathering operation. Bill discovered that the HOA's bank account had regular transfers to offshore accounts. Sarah found that none of the board members had ever filed the required financial disclosure forms with the state. Frank learned that 3 other HOAs in the county, all with connections to Robert Winters, had similar complaints from veterans. Meanwhile, I set up a secure cloud storage system where we could upload all our evidence, accessible only to our core team. I also installed additional cameras around my property, including some hidden ones that even Karen's eagle eyes wouldn't spot. Rachel's hospital intelligence proved invaluable. She discovered that Robert Winters had a standing golf game every Wednesday afternoon, followed by a board meeting that kept him occupied until late evening. That gave us our window. On the 3rd Wednesday of our operation, I followed Karen as she left her house after Robert departed for golf. Instead of her usual rounds of the neighborhood, she drove to a storage facility on the edge of town. Using the counter-surveillance techniques I'd learned in the military, I watched as she entered a unit and emerged with a file box. I trailed her to a small office building owned by one of Robert's companies. She spent 2 hours inside, then left without the box. I waited until she was gone, then approached the building. The security was laughable, a simple keypad lock that I could have bypassed in my sleep. But I didn't need to break in. Not yet. That night, I briefed the team on what I'd found. "They're keeping records off-site," I explained. "Smart move for criminals, but it tells us they know what they're doing is illegal." "So what's our next step?" Bill asked. "We've got enough to take to the authorities," Mike said. "But we need to be strategic about who we approach. Local police are out, too many connections to Winters. County sheriff is a maybe, but I'd prefer to go straight to the state level." "I've got another idea," I said, thinking of Colonel Thompson's last call. "What if we set a trap? Give them enough rope to hang themselves." "What kind of trap?" Sarah asked, leaning forward. I smiled. "The kind that catches power-drunk HOA board members red-handed. But I'll need everyone's help to pull it off." The plan was simple but effective. We would create a situation that would force Karen and her cronies to reveal their true colors, while ensuring we had plenty of witnesses and documentation. And we'd do it in a way that would be impossible for even the friendliest local official to ignore. "It's risky," Mike warned. "If they realize what we're doing, they could retaliate." "They're already retaliating," Frank pointed out. "At least this way, we're controlling the battlefield." We spent the next few days preparing. Each team member had specific responsibilities, from surveillance to documentation to creating a secure communication network. We gathered equipment, rehearsed scenarios, and established contingency plans. As I reviewed our operation plan, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. These ordinary citizens had transformed into an effective unit, united by a common purpose and a shared enemy. It reminded me of my days commanding troops, the camaraderie, the focus, the determination to complete the mission no matter what. The night before we launched our operation, I sat on my back porch, nursing a bourbon and watching the stars. My neighbor's motion sensor light clicked on, and I tensed, ready for another HOA confrontation. But it was just Bill coming over with a six-pack. "Couldn't sleep," he explained, handing me a beer. "Too wired thinking about tomorrow." "That's normal before an operation," I assured him. Even the best soldiers get pre-mission jitters. We sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the crickets and distant traffic. You know, Bill said finally, before you moved in, I was thinking of selling. Couldn't take the harassment anymore. But now, he gestured with his beer. Now I remember why I bought here in the first place. It's a good neighborhood with good people. We just let the wrong ones take control. I nodded, understanding completely. That's why we're doing this, Bill. Not just to stop the corruption, but to take back our community. As Bill headed home, I checked my phone one last time. A text from Colonel Thompson confirmed our final piece of the puzzle was in place. Everything was ready. Tomorrow, Karen Winters and her HOA reign of terror would come to an end. As I sat in my truck with this fake cop pointing what looked like a real gun at me, I felt strangely calm. 25 years in the military teaches you to recognize the difference between someone trained to use a weapon and someone who learned from watching Law and Order. Dave's hand was shaking. His face had gone from red to pale, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool spring air. Behind him, Karen stood with her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of triumph and anxiety. "I'm not going to ask you again, Miller," Dave said, his voice cracking slightly. "Exit the vehicle now." I kept my hands visible on the steering wheel, making no sudden movements. "Dave, you need to think about what you're doing. Impersonating a law enforcement officer is a felony. Brandishing a weapon during the commission of a crime upgrades it to a Class 2 felony. That's 5 to 10 years minimum." "He's not impersonating anyone," Karen snapped. "The HOA has deputized him as our enforcement officer. It's all perfectly legal." I almost laughed. "That's not how law works, Karen. HOAs can't deputize anyone. Only the county sheriff can do that." Dave's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. I could see doubt creeping into his eyes. He wasn't a hardened criminal, just a retiree drunk on a little power who'd gotten in way over his head. "The board voted," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We have the authority to issue fines for unapproved lawn ornaments? Maybe. To pull people over on public roads and point weapons at them? Absolutely not." I kept my tone conversational, non-threatening. "Dave, think about your grandkids. Do you want them visiting you in prison?" His weapon, which I could now see was indeed a taser, dipped slightly. Karen noticed too and stepped forward. "Don't listen to him, Dave. He's trying to intimidate you, just like he's been undermining our authority for months. We voted on this. The board approved emergency measures for residents who pose a threat to community standards." I glanced in my rearview mirror, noting the timing was perfect. The convoy I'd been expecting was approaching, right on schedule. Colonel Thompson had come through. "Karen," I said calmly, "I'm going to reach for my phone very slowly. I'm not armed, and I'm not resisting whatever this is supposed to be. I just want to make a call." "Don't you dare," she hissed. "Dave, if he moves, you tase him." Dave looked increasingly uncertain. "Karen, maybe we should just call the real police. This is getting out of hand." "We are the authority here." Karen's voice rose to a shriek. "The police work for the county, and Robert has the county in his pocket. We don't need them." I slowly reached toward my pocket, watching Dave's reaction. His weapon came back up, but his hand was shaking so badly now I doubted he could hit me if he tried. "Last warning," he said weakly. "Dave," I said quietly, "look behind you." He didn't turn around immediately, probably thinking it was a trick. But Karen did, and the color drained from her face. "What is that?" she whispered. Coming up the road behind us was a convoy of 5 olive-drab military vehicles, 2 Humvees and 3 transport trucks. They were moving at a deliberate pace, and as they approached, they began to slow down. Dave finally turned to look, and his arm dropped to his side in shock. "What the hell?" I took the opportunity to reach for my phone, but I didn't need to make a call. Everything was already in motion. The lead Humvee pulled alongside Karen's Mercedes, effectively blocking it in. The other vehicles formed a perimeter around us, and soldiers, actual soldiers in uniform, began to exit the vehicles. "What is this?" Karen demanded, her voice rising in panic. You can't do this. This is private property. Actually, ma'am, I said, finally opening my truck door and stepping out. This is a public road, and these gentlemen are just concerned citizens who happen to be passing by. The lead Humvee's door opened, and Colonel James Thompson stepped out, resplendent in his full dress uniform. At 6 feet 4 inches with shoulders like a linebacker, he cut an imposing figure. "Jack," he called out, striding toward us. "Everything all right here?" Dave's taser clattered to the pavement as he backed away, hands raised. We were just impersonating police officers and threatening a civilian with a weapon," Thompson finished for him. "Interesting hobby you've got there." Karen found her voice again. "This is none of your business. We are conducting official HOA business with a resident who has repeatedly violated community guidelines." Thompson raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, I don't know what an HOA is, but I do know that pulling someone over on a public road requires actual law enforcement authority, which you clearly don't have." "My husband," Karen began, "will be very interested to hear about this, I'm sure." Thompson cut her off. "As will the state attorney general, who, coincidentally, was my roommate at West Point." The soldiers had formed a loose circle around us, not threatening but definitely containing the situation. Several had their phones out, recording everything. Karen noticed and became even more agitated. "You can't film me without my permission. That's a violation of my privacy rights." One of the soldiers, a young woman with staff sergeant stripes, smiled. "Actually, ma'am, in this state you have no expectation of privacy in a public place. It's called a one-party consent law." Dave had backed up against Karen's car, looking like he might be sick. "Karen, I think we should leave. This isn't what I signed up for." "Don't you dare back out now, Dave," Karen snapped. "We voted on this. The board approved it." "The board approved impersonating police officers?" Thompson asked mildly. "I'd love to see those meeting minutes." I leaned against my truck, feeling the tension drain from my shoulders. The plan was working perfectly. Karen and Dave were digging themselves deeper with every word, and it was all being recorded from multiple angles. "Colonel," I said, "these individuals have been running a fraudulent HOA operation for years. They've been issuing fake fines, threatening homeowners, and embezzling funds. Today, they escalated to impersonating law enforcement and threatening me with a weapon." Thompson nodded gravely. "Serious allegations, Jack. Do you have evidence?" "Extensive documentation," I confirmed. "Financial records, witness statements, video evidence of harassment, and now this little incident." Karen's face had gone from white to mottled red. "This is absurd. We are a legally constituted homeowners association with the authority to enforce community standards. Then you won't mind providing your state registration number, your bond certification, and your official delegation of authority from the county," Thompson replied smoothly. Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The wail of police sirens in the distance broke the standoff. Someone, probably one of the neighbors watching from their windows, had called the actual police. "Perfect timing," Thompson remarked. "Now we can get this sorted out properly." 2 police cruisers pulled up, and officers approached cautiously, taking in the unusual scene. Military vehicles, soldiers, and a middle-aged woman in designer clothes having what appeared to be a meltdown in the middle of the road. "What's going on here?" the lead officer asked, hand resting casually on his holster. Before Karen could launch into her version of events, Thompson stepped forward, introducing himself and explaining the situation with the calm authority that comes from decades of command. These individuals were impersonating police officers and threatening the civilian with a weapon, he concluded, pointing to the taser still lying on the pavement. "My men and I witnessed it while passing through on our way back to base." The officer looked skeptical until one of the soldiers stepped forward with his phone, showing the video he'd recorded. The officer's expression hardened as he watched. "Is that a real police light in your vehicle, ma'am?" he asked Karen, pointing to the flashing lights still visible in her SUV's windshield. "It's an HOA enforcement vehicle," she replied stiffly. "We have the authority to." "No, ma'am, you don't." The officer cut her off. Not even close. He turned to his partner. Call for backup. We're going to need statements from everyone. As the situation unfolded, neighbors began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Bill and Sarah were among them, along with Frank, Rachel, and others who had joined our resistance movement. They gathered at a respectful distance, watching as Karen and Dave were separated for questioning. I caught Bill's eye and gave him a subtle nod. Phase 1 of our plan had worked perfectly. Karen and Dave had taken the bait, escalating their intimidation tactics to the point of criminal behavior, and they'd done it in front of impeccable witnesses. As one of the officers approached to take my statement, I reached into my truck and pulled out a thick folder. Copies of all the evidence we'd gathered over the past weeks. Financial records showing the embezzlement. Falsified legal documents with forged county seals. Witness statements detailing years of harassment and intimidation. Officer, I said, handing him the folder. I think you're going to want to see this. It goes way beyond what happened here today. The officer leafed through the documents, his eyebrows rising higher with each page. Sir, this is extensive. How long has this been going on? Years, I replied. And it's not just our neighborhood. They're running the same scam in at least 3 other communities. From the corner of my eye, I could see Karen being handcuffed and read her rights. Dave was already in the back of a police cruiser, his head in his hands. Karen's face was a mask of fury as she caught me watching. This isn't over, Miller, she shouted as the officers led her toward the second cruiser. Robert will have this sorted out before dinner. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I smiled calmly. Actually, Karen, I do. And so does the state attorney general, who received copies of all this evidence this morning. Her face went slack with shock as the implications sank in. This wasn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. This was fraud, racketeering, impersonating law enforcement, serious charges that even her husband's connections couldn't make disappear. As the police cruisers pulled away, Colonel Thompson approached, extending his hand. Just like old times, eh, Jack? You always did know how to set a perfect ambush. I shook his hand, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. Couldn't have done it without you, sir. Your timing was impeccable. He grinned. When you told me what these vultures were doing to veterans in your community, there was no way I was sitting this one out. The whole unit volunteered. I looked around at the soldiers, many of whom were now chatting with the neighbors, and felt a surge of pride. This was what community looked like. People standing up for each other, refusing to be intimidated by petty tyrants. The battle wasn't over, of course. Karen's husband still had connections, and the legal process would take time. But the first decisive blow had been struck, and there would be no going back to the way things were. As Thompson and his unit prepared to continue their journey, he clapped me on the shoulder. You know, Jack, civilian life suits you better than I expected. You found yourself a new mission. I nodded, watching as my neighbors gathered together, no longer afraid, no longer isolated. Best deployment I've ever had, sir. The look on the fake cop's face when 5 military vehicles pulled up behind him was worth every citation, every threatening letter, and every sleepless night. His tactical vest suddenly looked like a Halloween costume at a formal dinner. Dave's mouth hung open as he stared at the convoy of olive-drab vehicles surrounding us. The soldiers who emerged weren't just any unit. They were the 75th Ranger Regiment, my old outfit, some of the most elite soldiers in the U.S. Army. They moved with the quiet confidence that comes from years of training and real-world operations, forming a loose perimeter around the scene. Karen, who had been screeching about HOA bylaws and her husband's connections, fell suddenly silent. Her Mercedes was now effectively boxed in between my truck and the lead Humvee, and the realization that she wasn't in control anymore was slowly dawning on her face. What is the meaning of this? She finally managed, her voice higher than usual. This is harassment. I'll have all of you arrested. Major Thompson, my former commanding officer, stepped forward. At 6'4" with shoulders like a linebacker and the ramrod-straight posture of a career officer, he cut an imposing figure in his combat uniform. Ma'am, he said with exaggerated politeness, I couldn't help but notice that you appear to be detaining one of my former soldiers using what looks suspiciously like impersonation of law enforcement. That's a federal offense in case you weren't aware. Dave's hand, still holding the taser, began to tremble visibly. This is HOA business, he stammered. We have the authority to pull over vehicles on public roads? Thompson interrupted, raising an eyebrow. To brandish weapons at civilians? I'd be very interested to see that particular statute. I remained in my truck, hands still visible on the steering wheel, watching the scene unfold with a sense of satisfaction. The plan was working perfectly. When I'd learned that Thompson's unit would be conducting a training exercise in the area, I'd arranged my hardware store run to coincide with their convoy route. The timing couldn't have been better. One of the Rangers, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, approached my window. "You okay in there, sir?" he asked, eyeing Dave and Karen warily. "Never better, Sergeant," I replied with a smile. "Just enjoying the show." Dave finally lowered the taser, his bravado evaporating under the stern gazes of a dozen combat veterans. "Karen," he said quietly, "maybe we should call Robert. This is getting out of hand." Karen wasn't ready to surrender yet. "Don't you dare back down, Dave. We have every right to enforce community standards. These soldiers are trespassing on private property." "This is a public road, ma'am," Thompson pointed out mildly, "maintained by county taxes. Speaking of which, I understand your HOA has been collecting quite a bit in dues over the years. I'd be curious to know where all that money has gone, considering the state of your neighborhood infrastructure." Karen's face flushed an alarming shade of red. "Our finances are none of your business. The HOA books are private." "Actually," I said, finally stepping out of my truck, "as a homeowner and HOA member, I have a legal right to review those books. Section 720.303 of the State Property Code requires HOAs to make all financial records available to members with reasonable notice. I've been requesting those records for 2 months now." The wail of police sirens in the distance added a new element to the standoff. Someone, probably one of the neighbors watching from their windows, had called the actual police. "Perfect timing," Thompson remarked. "Now we can get this sorted out properly." Dave looked like he might be sick. "Karen, I told you this was going too far. I didn't sign up for this. I just wanted to make sure people kept their lawns mowed." "Shut up, Dave," Karen hissed. "Robert will handle this. He always does." 2 police cruisers pulled up, and officers approached cautiously, taking in the unusual scene. Military vehicles, soldiers in combat gear, and 2 civilians who looked like they were playing dress-up as law enforcement. "What's going on here?" the lead officer asked, hand resting casually on his holster. Before Karen could launch into her version of events, Thompson stepped forward, introducing himself and explaining the situation with the calm authority that comes from decades of command. These individuals were impersonating police officers and threatening the civilian with a weapon, he concluded, pointing to the taser still in Dave's hand. "My unit witnessed it while passing through on our way back to base." The officer looked skeptical until one of the Rangers stepped forward with his phone, showing the video he'd recorded. The officer's expression hardened as he watched. "Is that a real police light in your vehicle, sir?" he asked Dave, pointing to the flashing lights still visible in the SUV's windshield. "It's an HOA enforcement vehicle," Karen interjected. "We have the authority to." "No, ma'am, you don't." The officer cut her off. "Not even close." He turned to his partner. "Call for backup. We're going to need statements from everyone." As more police arrived, the situation quickly spiraled beyond Karen's control. Officers found fake badges, unauthorized weapons, and falsified legal documents in the SUV. Dave, now thoroughly terrified, was singing like a canary, explaining how Karen had convinced the HOA board that they needed enhanced enforcement measures for problem residents. She said her husband cleared it with the county. Dave explained to a detective, his voice shaking, said we had special dispensation because of the unique security needs of our community. Karen was placed in handcuffs after attempting to call her husband, and then threatening the officers with consequences for their careers. As she was led to a police car, She fixed me with a venomous glare. This isn't over, Miller. Robert will have this sorted out before dinner. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I smiled calmly. Actually, Karen, I do. And so does the State Attorney General's office, which received copies of all your fraudulent documents this morning, along with statements from 24 homeowners detailing years of harassment and intimidation. Her face went slack with shock. This wasn't just about a traffic stop gone wrong anymore. This was about years of fraud, embezzlement, and abuse of power. As the police cars pulled away with Karen and Dave in the back seats, neighbors began to emerge from their homes. Bill and Sarah were among the first to approach, followed by Frank, Rachel, and others who had suffered under Karen's regime. Is it really over? Sarah asked, watching the police cars disappear around the corner. The HOA reign of terror? Yes, I confirmed. The legal proceedings? Just beginning. Thompson approached, extending his hand. Just like old times, Jack? You always did know how to set a perfect ambush. I shook his hand, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. Couldn't have done it without you, sir. Your timing was impeccable. He grinned. When you told me what these vultures were doing to veterans in your community, there was no way I was sitting this one out. The whole unit volunteered. As Thompson and his rangers prepared to continue their journey, the neighbors gathered around, thanking them for their intervention. It was a surreal scene, elite soldiers chatting with suburban homeowners about lawn care and property values. You know, Bill said, watching the military vehicles pull away, I've lived here for 15 years, and this is the first time I felt like it's actually a community. I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. For too long, these people had been isolated by fear, afraid to stand up to the petty tyrants who had appointed themselves as rulers of the neighborhood. The police detective returned, notebook in hand. Mr. Miller, we're going to need a formal statement from you. And I understand you have additional evidence regarding these individuals. More than you can imagine, I replied. Financial records showing embezzlement of HOA funds. Falsified legal documents with forged county seals. Witness statements detailing years of harassment and intimidation. The detective's eyebrows rose. This goes beyond what happened today, doesn't it? Way beyond, I confirmed. They've been running this scam for years. Not just here, but in at least 3 other communities. As I gave my statement, I watched my neighbors talking among themselves, already discussing plans for a legitimate homeowners association. One that would serve the community rather than rule it. Frank approached, offering me a cup of coffee from a thermos. You know, Jack, when you moved in, I figured you for just another retiree looking for a quiet place to live out your days. Never expected you to lead a revolution. I laughed. Not a revolution, just a correction, of course. Well, whatever you call it, you've done what none of us had the guts to do for years, he said, raising his cup in a toast. Welcome to the neighborhood, soldier. As the afternoon wore on, more police arrived, along with local news crews drawn by the unusual story. Karen's husband Robert showed up, red-faced and blustering, only to find himself facing questions from detectives about his role in the scheme. The look on his face when he realized that his wife's arrest wasn't going to disappear with a phone call was almost as satisfying as watching Karen being led away in handcuffs. Years of connections and backroom deals weren't going to help him now. Not with the State Attorney General's office involved and too many witnesses to intimidate. By evening, the police had cleared the scene, but the neighborhood remained abuzz with activity. Impromptu gatherings formed on lawns and driveways, as people who had lived as strangers despite being neighbors for years finally connected over their shared experience of liberation. Standing on my front porch, watching the community come alive, I felt a sense of accomplishment that rivaled anything I'd experienced in my military career. This wasn't about taking down an enemy. It was about building something better in the aftermath. Sarah approached, a plate of cookies in hand. The neighborhood is organizing a proper thank you for you and your military friends, she said. Nothing fancy, just a barbecue this weekend. Will your former commander be able to make it? I'll ask him, I promised. Though I think the Rangers might be a bit much for a neighborhood barbecue. She laughed. After what we've been through with Karen and her goon squad, A few dozen elite soldiers would be a welcome change of pace. As darkness fell, I sat on my porch with a cold beer, enjoying the sounds of a neighborhood coming back to life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Legal proceedings, reorganizing the HOA, rebuilding community trust. But for tonight, it was enough to savor the victory. The fake HOA cop had pulled me over, but the army convoy behind me had helped deliver justice. Sometimes, timing really is everything. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. I prefer mine served with a side of federal charges and a class action lawsuit for dessert. The weeks following Karen and Dave's arrest were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, community meetings, and media attention. The local newspaper ran a front-page story with the headline, HOA Gone Wild, Fake Cops, Real Crimes. National outlets picked it up soon after, and suddenly Oak Ridge Estates was the poster child for HOA abuse across America. The investigation revealed a scheme more extensive than even I had imagined. Karen and Robert Winters, along with select board members, had been running what amounted to a racketeering operation for nearly a decade. They'd embezzled over $2 million in HOA dues, using shell companies for maintenance contracts that either never happened or were grossly overcharged. The district attorney's office filed multiple charges: fraud, embezzlement, impersonating law enforcement, extortion, and conspiracy. Karen's infamous enforcement team crumbled under questioning, with most members claiming they had no idea of the extent of the illegal activities. Dave, facing serious jail time, turned state's evidence in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony was damning. Karen told us the rules didn't apply to us because we were protecting property values, he explained in a sworn statement. She said her husband had arranged special authority with the county for our HOA to have enhanced enforcement powers. Robert Winters tried to leverage his connections to make the charges disappear, but he'd underestimated how toxic his name had become. Politicians and officials who had once happily accepted his campaign contributions now couldn't distance themselves fast enough. His attempts to call in favors only dug him deeper, revealing corrupt relationships with building inspectors, zoning officials, and even a judge. 3 weeks after the arrests, I received a call from the state attorney general himself. "Mr. Miller," he said, "I want to personally thank you for bringing this case to our attention. We've been looking into HOA abuses across the state, and your evidence has helped us connect dots in several other communities." "Just doing my civic duty, sir," I replied, though I couldn't help feeling a surge of satisfaction. "Well, your civic duty has exposed one of the most egregious cases of neighborhood corruption we've seen," he continued. "We're expanding our investigation to 3 other communities where the Winters had their fingers in HOA operations. The legal proceedings would take months, but the immediate effect on our neighborhood was transformative. Without Karen's iron fist, people began to rediscover what community actually meant. Neighbors who had been afraid to even wave at each other now stopped to chat. Children played in front yards that had previously been off-limits. American flags appeared on porches throughout the neighborhood. A month after the arrests, we held a community meeting in the local elementary school cafeteria. Nearly every homeowner in Oak Ridge Estates attended, a stark contrast to the sparsely attended, Karen-controlled meetings of the past. "First order of business," Bill announced, having been nominated as interim chair, "is to determine if we even want to continue having an HOA." The discussion was lively but respectful. Some wanted to dissolve the HOA entirely, arguing that we'd be better off without any restrictions. Others pointed out the benefits of a properly run association, maintaining common areas, organizing community events, and yes, ensuring some basic standards for the neighborhood. "What if we created something new?" I suggested. "Not an HOA as we've known it, but a neighborhood association focused on building community rather than policing it." The idea resonated. By the end of the meeting, we had formed a committee to draft a new charter with clear limitations on power, transparent financial management, and term limits for board members. Sarah, who had emerged as one of our community's most thoughtful voices, proposed a radical idea. What if we took some of the recovered funds, assuming the court orders restitution, and created a neighborhood improvement grant program? Homeowners could apply for small grants to improve their properties in ways that benefit everyone. The suggestion was met with enthusiastic approval. It was exactly the kind of positive, community-building approach we needed. Meanwhile, the legal case against Karen and Robert continued to unfold. The prosecution discovered offshore accounts where much of the embezzled money had been hidden. They also found evidence that the Winters had used similar tactics in previous neighborhoods before moving to Oak Ridge Estates. 6 months after their arrest, both Karen and Robert pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for returning the stolen funds. The judge, unimpressed by their attempts to justify their actions, sentenced them to 5 years in prison and ordered full restitution to the homeowners of Oak Ridge Estates. Dave received a suspended sentence and probation in exchange for his cooperation. The last I heard, he was working at a garden center in another state, presumably keeping his opinions on other people's lawns to himself. The day the restitution checks arrived was like Christmas in July. Each household received approximately $15,000, their share of the recovered funds. Many residents used the money for home improvements they'd been putting off due to the financial strain of the excessive HOA fees. Frank used his to install a proper flagpole in his front yard, with a spotlight to illuminate his American flag at night. Rachel built a wheelchair-accessible ramp for her mother who was coming to live with her. Bill and Sarah renovated their kitchen. As for me, I built a workshop in my backyard where I could pursue my woodworking hobby without fear of citation. Our new neighborhood association took shape with a clear charter, transparent operations, and a focus on enhancing community rather than controlling it. Dues were reduced to a reasonable $50 per month, with detailed financial reports available to all members. Board meetings were held in the community park when weather permitted, or in the elementary school during winter months. Open, accessible, and welcoming to all. 1 year after the confrontation that had brought down Karen's regime, we held a neighborhood block party to celebrate. The street was closed to traffic. Tables lined the sidewalks laden with potluck dishes, and children played games on lawns that were no longer measured with rulers. Major Thompson and several members of his unit attended as honored guests. They were out of uniform, but their military bearing was unmistakable as they mingled with the residents, sharing stories and accepting thanks for their timely intervention. "You've built something special here, Jack," Thompson said as we stood watching the celebration. "Not many neighborhoods have this kind of bond. Sometimes you need to go through hell to appreciate heaven," I replied, "and having a common enemy tends to bring people together." He laughed. "Well, your common enemy is serving time in a minimum security prison, so I'd say mission accomplished." As the sun began to set, Bill called for everyone's attention. "We have something to present to the man who made all this possible," he announced, gesturing for me to join him. Reluctantly, I made my way to the front of the crowd. "Jack Miller moved to our neighborhood expecting a peaceful retirement," Bill said. "Instead, he found a community under siege by its own leadership. Rather than selling his house and moving on, he chose to fight. Not just for himself, but for all of us." Sarah stepped forward, holding a plaque. "This is from all of us," she said, presenting it to me. "A small token of our appreciation." The plaque read, "To Jack Miller, who reminded us that community is worth fighting for. Oak Ridge Estates, forever grateful." I'm not a man who tears up easily, but I felt my eyes growing damp as I accepted the plaque and looked out at the faces of my neighbors, now friends. "I didn't do anything special," I said. "I just refused to be bullied, something I learned in the Army a long time ago. The real heroes are all of you, who had the courage to stand up and reclaim your neighborhood." The applause was warm and genuine, and as I looked around at the transformed community, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced since before my first deployment. This was what I'd fought for all those years, not just abstract concepts like freedom and democracy, but the right of ordinary people to live with dignity and mutual respect. The next morning, I installed my new mailbox, painted in the exact color I wanted. Not the shade of autumn whisper that Karen had insisted was the only acceptable hue. As I secured it to the post, I noticed movement across the street. Karen and Robert's house, which had sat empty since their arrest, had a sold sign in the front yard. A moving truck was parked in the driveway, and a family with 2 young children was unloading furniture. I crossed the street to introduce myself, extending my hand to the father. "Welcome to Oak Ridge Estates," I said. "I'm Jack Miller, your neighbor from across the way." "Tom Chen," he replied with a firm handshake. "That's my wife Lisa and our kids, Emma and Tyler. We've heard this is a great neighborhood." I smiled. "It is now. Let me know if you need any help settling in. And don't worry about the HOA. We do things a little differently around here these days." As I walked back to my house, I couldn't help but appreciate the irony. The place Karen had ruled with an iron fist was now truly the welcoming community she had always pretended it was. Sometimes justice isn't just about punishment for wrongdoing. It's about creating something better from the ashes of what was destroyed. Thank you all for watching this video to the end. If you've ever dealt with an overbearing HOA or any kind of neighborhood power struggle, I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it, share it with anyone who might be fighting their own HOA battles, and subscribe to the channel for more real-life stories of standing up to bullies and bureaucrats. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next video about everyday heroes fighting back against the system. Until next time, remember, community is worth fighting for.